Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. We are starting a brand new series today with this episode, and the series is called Questions of Our Day. And we wanted to start off with a very easy question. Why is Christianity, or isn't Christianity escapist? And we are here with Dr. Darrell Bock. He's from Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dr. Bock, let's just jump right in. Why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Okay, well, I'm Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm also Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies here. I'm in my 42nd year at the seminary, so it means I started teaching when I was 5 years old. And married, I engage in a global ministry. I'm getting ready to leave for about 3 months straight this summer, where I'll be in Poland, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And we are mostly in the Gospels and Acts in terms of the things that I teach, stuff related to historical Jesus, and then the cultural engagement stuff that I do to help people think about how the church functions in a pluralistic world.
Just to jump in, I first encountered you when I was a sophomore at University of Valley Forge studying pastoral ministries and the Gospels classes. And between your Luke commentary from the NIV application to your Ephesians in the Tyndale commentary had a significant impact on my life. So I just want to say thank you for that. It means a lot. And
well, you're very welcome. Yeah, thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, and so you have a lot of credibility here. But before we get started, you've started talking about cultural engagement with one of your most famous students to us. His name's Rob Catalani. Why don't you tell our listeners, for those of you who don't know, Why God Why is part of Browncroft Community Church. Rob is our senior pastor. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about Rob as a student and some of your conversations with him in cultural engagement?
Well, we signed a blood pact that says I shouldn't say very much. No, Rob, Rob is one of those students who comes and he's interested in developing in terms of ministry, but he's also very aware of the challenges of what ministry represents in the kind of world that we live in. And so he developed an interest in that regard. And so we've stayed in contact. Once he left seminary, he wasn't one of these people who believe, well, seminary does this thing over here, and then there's the real world over there. And so, we're kind of like this zoo off to the side. And he didn't believe that. And so he went into ministry. We've stayed in contact about some of these issues. And, he's someone who shows a real concern and desire to have what I would describe as a holistic ministry, where you're not only preaching content of the Bible, but you're really asking hard, full questions about how that fits into life.
No, I appreciate you saying that. Let's transition a little bit, because I actually think that that's a good framework for us. Some people that know the Gospels, they might think of Jesus with the little children, Jesus throwing the tables over, and Jesus is this nice and kind figure, almost like a grandpa. And then you decide to take this turn to cultural topics, very, very difficult topics. Some people might see that as connected. Some people might see that as disconnected. Can you walk us through that process of being a scholar in the Gospels to now someone that's dealing with some of these cultural trends that we're talking about?
Well, let me frame your question a little bit by saying it this way. Jesus is not Santa Claus. And so Jesus was very serious about life. He was very serious about the flaws that human beings have, how to deal with those, what they can and can't do for themselves, and what they need God for, that kind of thing. So the entering question is Christianity escapist? To which my reply is, no, Christianity is realism. It's realistic about where people are. And if you don't think we can be a mess, just turn on your television during news time. And all of a sudden it becomes very clear by the nature of the news and what we deal with from day to day, that we do a less than stellar job of relating to one another well in the midst of the different kinds of people that we have and the kinds of mixtures that the pluralism that we face. We don't do well with our differences. And we also don't do well with our responsibility for how those differences get dealt with. And the Bible has a technical theological term for handling that poorly. And one of those technical terms is the word sin, that we treat each other poorly, that we don't respond as we ought, those kinds of things. In systematic theology, we call that total depravity. We don't mean, by total depravity, we don't mean we're as bad as you can possibly imagine, but we're bad enough. And it impacts our relationships. It impacts our marriages. It impacts our work. And Jesus came to deal with that. And that's not sitting on the lap of someone who's dressed in red, bringing your list of what you want for Christmas to that person. That's about looking in a mirror and seeing what's really there.
I love how you just kind of jumped into the question. You're making my job easier. So there's some people that would say Jesus is Santa Claus. He just wants to do nice things. I think this question, isn't Christianity escapist, comes a little bit from people that feel like Jesus is very disconnected from the issues of our day. So when we think of the political landscape, when we think of racism, when we think of even the interplay of science and religion, that Jesus just seems disconnected. How would you respond to that? And maybe you disagree with me. Maybe that's not where some of the questioning comes from.
Well, no, I think that probably is true, but I think it's hard to argue that Jesus is disconnected to life when Jesus is very much connected with thinking through what the heart of the person is. We tend to define our world by the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the dilemmas that produces, but that's only half the equation. The other half of the equation is how we respond to those situations we find ourselves in, what created those situations to begin with, et cetera. Those all come from the hearts of people and the way they respond to what's around them. So when I say Christianity is about realism as opposed to escapism, that's what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, a lot of people want to pursue life and not look at hard issues. They don't want to look inside. They want to do everything they can to avoid looking inside. And so if we're going to talk about escapism, we should talk about the way in which the distractions of life and the entertainment associated with life, et cetera, distract us from really thinking about what's really going on. Or another way to illustrate it is to think about, when I talk about difficult conversations a lot when I'm in ministry and talking about cultural engagement, I say, there's the topic that you're thinking about. That's what people think they're talking about. They're actually almost never talking about that topic. They are, but they're not. What's really going on are the lenses they use to look at that topic and the way their identity is tied into what it is that they're talking about. And so and I'll get personal for a second, when you fight with your wife, you're usually not fighting about the thing that you're talking about. You're actually fighting about the way in which you're relating to one another through that thing that you're talking about. That's the heart. Okay. There is no deeper place in life than that. And so Christianity is not escapist. It can be executed in a way that is escapist, and it can look like it's escapist. But if it's the real deal, it's really asking questions about the heart, and the heart is at the center of what happens in life.
That's super practical and super helpful. If it's okay with you, let's kind of walk through an issue and kind of walk through those lenses, because I think this is really helpful. And we'll kind of get back to some of the other issues with this idea of Christianity being escapist. But we have an election this fall. And so I'll let you go whatever direction you want to go. But you think about when someone comes to you and talks to you about politics, and you can pick conservative or progressive, whoever it is, what are the lenses that you're trying to get to of, hey, there's a side that's going outside that we can't control, but what's going on inside of you? How have you walked with people and engaged in politics and the election?
We have come to a place where in the church, we have said what matters is policy and policy decisions, but character doesn't matter. We are defending things about character that 15 years ago we never would have defended, simply because the policies of the person we're talking about are very different. And that division, that schizophrenia, if I can say it that way, actually ignores the heart questions that we're talking about, or at least can. And so the tension that we have is that we have two sets of candidates, neither of whom is anything close to ideal, and for a variety of reasons. And people are making judgments about what they prioritize and looking at that. And the one thing discussion we ought to totally stay out of is the idea that one side has this all right and the other side has this all wrong. Both of them are a messy mix. And so that means that there is a character and, I'm going to say, a community discussion about how we treat one another in the midst of these conversations about policy and the things that we should be doing, that is as important as the policies themselves. Because we've got to ask ourselves what we're doing to ourselves as a community by the way we talk about one another and engage with one another in the midst of our disagreements. So for me, the election is the election's obviously important. I mean, who leads us is important. But I think we've lost sight of why we're fraying as a community. And that needs as much attention in thinking about how we engage as anything else. And I think we're very, very poor at understanding where someone else is coming from and why, and trying to understand where they're coming from that position, perhaps versus the position I hold, and wrestling with how to do a better job at that conversation than worrying about who I cast my vote for.
Mm. So I want to kind of come back to this escapist, because I like the way that you talked about that, where we're not going to separate sides. I grew up as a kid during the 80s in Christianity, and I can remember I watched McGee and Me, which was a Christian TV show. I went to a Christian school. And a lot of those decisions from my parents were like personal decisions. So I'm not trying to throw shade at my parents, but there was a pervasive idea in church that we are in the world, not of it. And so it started kind of being this idea of we're creating, whether it's a counterculture, subculture, we can go into that, but I'm not sure that that's the right way. And then for a while it was I remember the day it was like okay to listen to secular music again. Like it was okay to listen to a song that's on the radio because it hints towards Christianity. And I wonder the people that are asking this question today that aren't Christians, isn't Christianity escapist? Because their assumption is that in 2024, the evangelical Christians making just generalized assumptions, live in the suburbs, vote Republican, and then they're trying to create their own subculture or counterculture, whichever way you want. Do you think that this is part of it? And obviously you live in Dallas, maybe it's more pronounced or less pronounced, but this idea of we're going to try to be the city on the hill, we're going to try to be separate, but maybe we've lost some of our engagement. Is that fair, or how would you kind of contextualize?
No, I think that's very fair. I think that you have a variety of reasons why people isolate themselves. But notice what you're doing when you isolate yourself in relationship to the commission that Jesus gave us. Because Jesus said, he didn't say go into your church and make disciples. He said go into the world and make disciples. So how do I do that? And how do I do that well? And when 30% of the population of the United States is said to be religiously unaffiliated, they're the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. They're the nuns. How do I have conversations with people who don't even have the categories that I have theologically about how I see the world. And how do I get to know where they're coming from? And how do I engage with them? And I can walk up to them and say, the Bible says, but if for them, the idea that God exists means that God can't say anything, and that the Bible isn't what I am purporting it to be, that they aren't even there to process what it is that I'm saying to them when I say the Bible says. How do I go there? And I like to tell people, the church is used to saying to the world, something's true because it's in the Bible, but it's actually the reverse that's going on. God puts it in the Bible because it's true on its own merit. It happens to reside in the Bible. So am I, as a believer, ready to explain why it is that something is inherently true, not because it's in the Bible, but because God is revealing what the realities of life are? And the Bible is the place where he's told us that. I tell them, the Bible is like a window that I look through to get towards the truth, but the truth is what's behind the window or what's in the window as opposed to the window itself. And so that means that I develop a different way of engagement. I have to, one, get a sense of where someone else is coming from. I call it getting a spiritual GPS reading, asking questions, hearing their story, how they see life, understanding what their whys and wherefores are. And when I'm doing that, my doctrinal meter's on mute. I'm just trying to listen for where they're coming from in the hopes of finding a bridge to have a conversation with them about what life is all about. And there will come a time when there's an assessment and the doctrinal meter goes back on. But initially, I want to understand where they're coming from, because I got to understand what categories do they have and what drives them in such a way that I can present the gospel to meet that need, because I believe the gospel meets all needs. And so it's a different way of doing things. We're used to having this content that we want to throw at people. And I'm sitting here going, well, before I throw that content at that person, I better know where that person's coming from.
I want to latch on to something that you just said there. So if I'm not a Christian and I'm asking this question, isn't Christianity escapist? I might have a Christian friend that says they hear my problems, they hear what I'm going through, and then they say to me, you know what, let go and let God. Or Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those that love God. In that moment that I've taken time to kind of share, this is where I'm coming from, how would you walk with someone through that instead of throwing those cliches that end up feeling like Christianity is escapist?
Well, the answer is I walk with them by walking with them. I take the time and the energy to engage with them, to listen to them, to wrestle with them. I tell people, if you listen carefully to the culture, you will hear the dislocation that comes from not knowing God. People will say things like, I'm trying to find myself. And I like to joke. I say, well, I thought you were here all along. But when we hear that phrase, what you're saying is someone is actually confessing that they're suspended wonderfully in midair. They don't know why they're here or what life is all about. And they're acknowledging it. So they just go through the motions. You hear it sometimes say, well, I'm just going through the motions of life. I'm just trying to earn a living, take care of my family. But if you ask me the deep questions of the heart about why I'm here and who I am, et cetera, I might attach it to an identity that I have in the public square or something like that. But if you really press me, I'm not sure why I'm here and what this is all about. That is being firmly suspended in midair. That's being dislocated. One thing the Bible does do for people is it gives them a sense of identity and location, which is fundamental to understanding why we're here. We're made in the image of God, to image God, to reflect Him, to engage in the kind of reflection and faculties that He's given us, and hopefully to do it in a positive way. I said we're all made. When God made man and woman and put them together, and He did it in a complementary way, He did it as a way so that they would collaborate together to manage the creation well. They were supposed to make the creation hum. They were all made to be hummers. We're supposed to make the creation hum. If you ask yourself, is the creation humming? You look around, you go, well, it's a little bumpy. So it's making sense out of who we are that allows us to be who we're designed to be and to live out the way we were made. And that gives us location. Most people are very dislocated in life. And unfortunately, most of our gospel presentations don't talk about that at all, or very little. And yet that's very central to the way in which the Bible presents it. We're supposed to be in covenantal relationship with God. We're supposed to be connected to him. We're supposed to have a sense of who we are and who he is. And we're supposed to have a sense of who we are as human beings together as a result of that. And when you miss that, you're suspended in midair, and people are saying, I'm trying to find myself. So we need to come alongside, walk alongside them, and help them find themselves.
Let's go deeper. I love that you brought up identity because it's a big question. I'm just going to pretend that you and I are walking alongside each other. This is the first time we've ever talked. At least, I've read your books, but you haven't talked with me yet. But Dr. Bock, I'm an entrepreneur, and my identity is being an entrepreneur. I'm starting, these businesses. I'm making money. Like I've moved up the social class. It just sounds escapist when you say I'm made in the image of God. Some people would say you said covenantal relationship. Can you tie the knots to that, or tie the string to that of why should I even care? I'm pretending to be an entrepreneur. I'd love to hear your thoughts in that conversation.
Well, my question would be, so why does it matter to you to be an entrepreneur?
So now I gotta go with this. No, you're asking that back.
Yeah, you opened up this lane. We're going to drive down it. Go ahead.
No, this is great. Let's do it. I grew up in a home where my dad was in a dead end job, and I totally wanted to make a huge difference in this world. And I wanted to make more money. I wanted to give my kids what I didn't have. What does God have to do with all of that?
Well, the question is, so what drives you in that regard? Is it self-interest? Is it interest for your family? Some of those values really do matter. I can understand why you would go there. But do you understand as an entrepreneur what it is that you offer people and what it is about your entrepreneurship that serves and is useful to them? Asking those kinds of questions. And are you thinking as an entrepreneur about what it takes to go beyond yourself and your own interests? Those kinds of questions. And what I'm trying to do, and let me tell you a sidebar conversation. What I'm trying to do in doing this is to say that actually what the Bible says is, if I'm properly connected to God, I put myself in a better position to be properly connected to other people. Mm. That's why the Great Commandment is what it is. You love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. That's a triangle. It's not just me and my God, which is what the West tends to think about spirituality as. It's my personal relationship with the living God, and that's the end of it. No, the Bible says I relate to God in such a way that I can function well in the world in which he's placed me, in relationship to others and in relationship to the stewardship that I have for where God has me. And that's the location, if you will. It isn't just a privatized walk with God. So your being an entrepreneur can be a part of that story. And it may be that what drives you personally to be an entrepreneur is drawing on elements of your being made in the image of God that take you there. And so I'd love to help you discover what that is and how you can do that even better than what you're doing now and make sense out of it all. That would be how I would come alongside.
That's really helpful. I think that kind of gives our listeners the unique approach that it's trying to draw together reality. I want to just shift a little bit. If someone said to you and asked you from the Gospels, what story would be the best response to this question, isn't Christianity escapist? What story would you take from the Gospels to kind of show what the Christianity view of this question is?
So how is it escapist to come into the world, serve people, and give your life for people so that they can have a better life? What's escapist about that? Because I've just summarized for you the story of Jesus. So I wouldn't take one story. I would take the whole of what Jesus is about and say, why is it that people matter enough that someone would do that? And let me add to it. Why is it that people matter enough that God would do that? Why is it that the short version of John 3:16 is, God so loved the world that he gave? And that's it. I mean, we know how the rest of the verse goes. He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish but have eternal life. That's not escapist. That's about as participatory as you can get in terms of caring for people. So the idea that Christianity only becomes escapist when someone who embraces Christianity says, I'm only going to care about how I live my personal, private, spiritual life. Then Christianity becomes escapist. But that's not the biblical call of how someone's supposed to live. I'm supposed to love God with all my heart, mind, and soul, and love my neighbor as myself, which assumes I'm connected to my neighbor and assumes I'm engaging with my neighbor. And that's about as participatory as it can get. So the Christianity can be escapist when it's misapplied, but that's not the real Christianity.
That's a lot right there. So we went back to the Bible, but let's kind of go back to today. So if Christians believe that Jesus is always present, omnipresent, but there's a difference if Jesus was here today with us on this podcast or with us in Rochester or Dallas, wherever Jesus would be. How do you think Jesus would engage this conversation, especially like as you think of cultural engagement, in the sense of, there's this feedback. Christians aren't engaged. They're only engaged in certain topics. What do you think Jesus would be doing differently today that some Christians aren't doing?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to the Great Commandment, because in the end, that's where God says we're supposed to be. We're supposed to care for him, and we're supposed to care for him enough to care for those that he made in his image. And that's why you love your neighbor like you love yourself, because you recognize the value that people have. Once I recognize the value that people have, that means that every relationship that I'm in, every encounter that I'm in becomes important. I don't have a secular sacred divide. Every moment is a sacred moment in some sense, and I'm supposed to treat it that way. And so, and again, I'm back. That's not escapist. That's about as participatory as you can get. So all of that is at work. So if Jesus were here, he would say, care about your neighbor, care about what goes on around you. Look to be that which contributes to society, not that which undercuts it. Those kinds of things. And he'd be urging us to do that in any and every sphere where God has us. There is no mundane element to life. All our relationships are matter, and all of our relationships have a sacred dimension to them. So Christ is with us, whether we recognize it or not, and every situation is filled with God, whether we recognize it or not. Again, that's not escapist. That's about as participatory as you can get.
Let's go specific. If Jesus walked by a protest, and you could pick the protest, or maybe it's general, how do you think Jesus would handle that?
I think he would ask us to understand to work hard to understand the nature of the difference. I tell people there are three kinds of issues in the public square in the world. There are the genuine worldview clashes where the starting points are so different, it's very, very difficult to have a common conversation because the starting points are just so diverse. And there are actually very few elements other than if you take, is God in this or not out of that conversation. There are very few conversations that are there. I think the same-sex conversation, the abortion conversation are two of those. It happen to be the two of the issues that the church is most focused on. They're the hardest conversations to have because the starting point for how someone inside the church who is kind of embraces the Bible and someone who doesn't, they're coming from such different places in terms of where they start out, makes the conversation hard. By the way, it doesn't relieve us of the pastoral responsibility of how we treat people in those conversations, but it's a hard place to have a substantive conversation. Second is what I call same goal, different route. So if I say racial reconciliation, okay, and I ask people, should the races be reconciled to one another? Should they work towards reconciliation? I'd get very high poll numbers. I'd say politicians would say, man, I'd love that approval rating. I'd love to get a number that high. You ask the second question, how do we do that? Now you're in your conversation, but at least you're trying to get to the same point. Okay, so that's different than the first category. The third category is the hard one, and it's where most of our public discourse lies, where most of our protests show up. And that is, we live in a fallen world. Because we live in a fallen world, our values are not properly aligned to one another. They collide. Now, that's an important observation because that means that each side is bringing something to the conversation that one needs to pay attention to. But what happens when values collide in this third category is our political parties or our ideologies or whatever say, this is the value that I'm going to hold on to. This is the value that I elevate. And then they try and either minimize or reduce the value that's in conflict with it, almost pretending that it's not there. And we have a binary conversation. Okay. And it's which side are you going to choose? And each side does it with a different value, with the value that's colliding. Okay. And we never have the conversation that we need. Conversation that we need is, how do I align these values or calibrate them in relationship to each other by taking both of them seriously? How do I do that? Because they're in misalignment. How do I realign them so they're in a better alignment? We never allow ourselves to have a conversation because we've chosen the value, here I stand, I can do no other. And we pretended that the other value doesn't have enough value to value. and we don't have the conversation that we need. So many protests are about an imbalance that exists in our world. And so you ask, how would I go about it? I would go about having a conversation to discover the nature of that imbalance and wrestle with what the best calibration is with the set of concerns that's driving the people on each side of that difference and try and work through that. That's what that would be the advice I would give. And how to even see the conversation, because we don't even see the conversation well enough to have the conversation.
As a follow-up to everything you just said, and it might align closely or it might be different, how would Jesus engage social media?
Jesus might stay off social media. Here's the problem with social media. Social media is an attempt to have a conversation where you've got a lot of people overhearing and can step in, which is not the best way to have a conversation. If you think about most of the conversations that you have that are personal and they're one-to-one, you don't have a lot of voices chiming in that one-to-one conversation. But social media takes place in an environment where I try and engage someone or even engage an idea, and I've got 20 different people, 40 different people, 100 different people chiming in. They all come with different backgrounds, different interests, different concerns, et cetera. There's no way to manage that conversation, and it becomes chaotic. So my point would be, I'm not sure Jesus would engage at least in that kind of way in social media, or if he engaged in social media, he would do it, I think, by attempting to present the best things and the uplifting things in life, and he would stay to some degree out of the controversies, that because it's too multi-layered a conversation to manage in a social media environment.
So as we kind of take this conversation to a close, I'm really glad we started here, and this being the first episode of the series. But let me see if I can sum up everything. And I won't do it necessarily in a theological way, but I want to kind of do it for our friends that might be outside of Christianity. Christianity at its healthiest is not escapist, but it's based in the reality of what happens on earth and the reality of heaven. Would you sum it up differently, or how would you say it?
I'd add one element, and what happens in reality in the heart of each person. Christianity is designed ultimately to be a mirror that allows us to see us for who we were created to be and who we actually are. And who we actually are in community, all those elements. And it's designed to help us be self-critical. It's also designed to help us appreciate the fact of why we need God, why we all need God, not just why I need God, why we all need God, and what God asks of us to make us the best people he made us to be when he made us in his image. So for me, it's not about a God who's out there and God on the earth and God in heaven. It's about the God who has made me the way I am in here, and wrestling with those questions and what my connection to him is supposed to be on the one hand. And as a result of understanding who I am before him, it puts me in a better place to interact with those around me.
I don't want to rush this because you've said this 2 or 3 times. I just want to make an observation and kind of hear your thoughts. I think something that I'm hearing that's wrong with the world, because you even mentioned that there's escapism into pleasure, binge watching, that in some ways, when we look to find ourselves as individuals, we look inward. But then when there's certain issues that are outside of us, we actually don't look inward, we look outward. So is that kind of the paradox that you're seeing, is that essentially we're disconnected? Yeah.
Yes. And let me say it this way. I think when we tend to look outward, and particularly when it's things that seem to be bigger than us, we want to fix blame and try and figure out where it is, rather than asking this question, and that is, what could be my contribution to make this better? So I may not be able to control the whole thing, but I can control the localized version of it that I get to participate in. I may not even be able to control that, but I may be able to contribute to that. So am I seeking to contribute to it in a way that is positive and beneficial, or am I so antagonized by what's going on that all I can do is complain about it? Those kinds of questions. So yeah. So I think I am saying that and let's be frank about this. A good hard look inside is hard. It doesn't come easy. So part of the reason I avoid it is because I don't want to look inside, because I don't want to see what's there. And then what Christianity does is it takes that muck, if I can say it that way. It takes that muck and it says, there is someone who helps you deal with that muck, and 2, there is a way to be a better, hopeful, more connected person. And that's very participatory, because God is involved in helping us see ourselves aright. God is involved in helping us make ourselves right. Actually, we don't make ourselves right. He does by his grace. That produces a gratitude of response and a hope and a positiveness that takes that muck that was there and totally transforms it. And so Christianity ultimately is supposed to be a place that's full of joy, peace, patience, etc., because I understand where I stand with God, and I understand that he stands for me, and that he has forgiven me, and that he's allowed me to participate in his grace, and that makes me a gracious person.
That's a great place to close. So the way that we close every episode is final remarks. So like a good professor, I'll share some final remarks, and then you can clean up whatever heresy I got wrong. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully there won't be much for me to say, but we'll see.
Yeah. I think this is a very legitimate question. And I think that starting here, there's so many layers to it. And I really appreciate, Dr. Bock, what you've said. And I love how you answer the question, just read the Gospels and you'll see that Jesus doesn't escape. But as I was preparing and kind of praying about this episode, I kept on thinking about the woman at the well in just kind of a snapshot. And I would encourage all of our listeners, whether you follow Jesus or not, to read that story. And it's in John chapter 4. And I think what's powerful about that story is Jesus brings that woman the reality of the 5 marriages and all the things that has happened to her and because of her and all of that. But he also brings her the reality of living water, and that Christianity at its best is not condemning but truthful. It's gracious but not but it's not going to just let things slide. But Jesus wasn't bringing that up to shame her. He was bringing that up to give her new life. And I think that as Christians and as followers of Jesus, ultimately, reality is our friend. And to be able to lean in these topics and to see Jesus at work, that's essentially what he did on the cross and resurrection, is reminding us that we don't have to be scared of reality. Christianity is not escapism, but it actually lets you see life in a fuller, more beautiful picture.
So let me give you a single word to summarize where the faith is supposed to take us. And it comes out of 1 Peter 3, verse 15, where the exhortation is that we ought to set Christ apart, and we ought to be prepared to give a defense for here's the single word, hope that is in us. Christianity takes us to a place of hope. It takes it, and hope is not a wish. Okay. Hope is a real anticipation of a restoration that God is in the midst of performing in a fallen creation. And you get to be a part of that. You get to be a part of that restoration. You live out of that restoration. You experience that restoration, and you impart that restoration by how you live. And so I think the idea here is that there's hope. So we started off talking about depravity, which is pretty depressing. Okay. But we end talking about hope because that's encouraging. And that's where God's supposed to take us through the gospel. That's not escapist.
Dr. Bock, thank you so much for your generosity. You've got a lot of work out there. Where's the best place for people to follow you? And also, you have a podcast out too.
Yeah, well, I'll direct them to the podcast. The podcast is called The Table Podcast. So that's voice.dts.edu/table podcast. That's voice.dts.edu/table podcast. I'm also on Facebook at Darrell L. Bock. That's another place where people can connect. But and most of the work that we do out of the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. So if you go to dts.edu and you go to the Hendricks Center, you'll see a lot of the work that we're involved in.
Awesome. And you can find out more about us at whygodwhypodcast.com. We're part of the Lumavaz Network, and we're brought to you by Browncroft Community Church. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're on our website, click subscribe. You'll get this episode and many others. Thank you so much for joining us.